The first time Claire Bennett realized her husband had not only betrayed her, but edited her out of her own life, she was sitting 12 floors above Boston Harbor, watching another woman's name appear on the boardroom screen where hers used to be. The conference room at Bennett Meridian Group was all glass, chrome, and careful silence, the kind of expensive silence that made even a cleared throat sound like a confession. Beyond the windows, the city looked polished and harmless, sunlight flashing off the water, traffic moving in thin silver lines below, people rushing through ordinary Tuesday lives while Claire's was being dismantled one slide at a time. Daniel Bennett stood at the head of the long walnut table in his Navy suit, smiling the smooth public smile investors trusted and employees feared. He had always known how to command a room. Claire had taught him where to stand, when to pause, which numbers to mention first, and how to make uncertainty sound like vision. Now he was using all of it without looking at her. On the screen behind him, under the heading Strategic Board Expansion, was the name Vanessa Cole. Beneath it, in smaller text, Senior Brand Advisor. Incoming board member. Claire felt the words settle over the room like frost. Vanessa sat 2 chairs away from Daniel, her posture perfect, her cream blazer spotless, her expression arranged into something between gratitude and triumph. She did not look nervous. That was what struck Claire first. A person who understood the weight of that seat would have looked at least a little afraid. Vanessa looked entertained. Around the table, 12 people pretended not to notice Claire's stillness. Men in tailored jackets studied their folders. 2 directors stared at their coffee cups as if answers might rise from the steam. Martin Shaw, the CFO, adjusted his glasses and looked down so quickly Claire almost pitied him. Almost. Cowardice in a $6,000 suit was still cowardice. Daniel clicked to the next slide. Claire's fingers rested on the navy leather notebook in front of her, the same notebook she had carried through the company's first investor pitch 7 years earlier, when Bennett Meridian had been 3 people, 1 rented office in Cambridge, and a bank balance so thin it felt fictional. She had built the client risk models in that notebook. She had written the retention strategy that saved their first hotel group account. She had mapped the acquisition pipeline Daniel later described in Forbes as instinct. His instinct had been her handwriting at 2 in the morning, her cold coffee, her missed birthdays, her careful calls to clients when payroll was 3 days from disaster. Then the final slide appeared, and something inside her went quiet. Leadership transition priorities. Daniel's name was there, of course. Vanessa's name was there. Martin's name was there. Claire's title had changed. Not founding strategy partner. Not co-founder. Not even board advisor. Former operations consultant. Former. The word was small, polite, and savage. Claire looked at Daniel then, really looked at him, and saw that he knew. This was not a mistake. It was a decision dressed in corporate language. Daniel folded his hands on the table and said, Claire has been invaluable behind the scenes, especially in the early years. But Bennett Meridian is entering a new era, and Vanessa understands where the future is going. No one moved. Even the air seemed embarrassed to be present. Claire heard the soft hum of the projector, the faint buzz of the lights overhead, the distant horn from the harbor below. Strange what the body chooses to remember when the heart refuses to break in public. Behind the scenes. Early years. New era. Each phrase was wrapped in velvet and sharpened at the edge. He was not only replacing her with his mistress. He was rewriting the story so the replacement looked reasonable. Vanessa lowered her eyes for one tasteful second, as though she were humble enough to deserve power she had not earned. Claire's thumb pressed against the edge of her notebook until the leather creased. There were betrayals that happened in bedrooms, whispered through locked phones and late meetings that ran too long. And then there were betrayals like this, performed under fluorescent lights, in front of people who owed their careers to your silence. Daniel kept speaking. Something about market perception, youth alignment, brand trust, the kind of expensive nonsense executives used when they wanted cruelty to sound like strategy. Claire did not interrupt him. She did not cry. She did not give Vanessa the satisfaction of seeing even one tremor cross her face. She simply closed the notebook. The sound was small, but it cut through the room cleanly. Daniel stopped mid-sentence. For the first time that morning, he looked uncertain. Claire stood, smoothing one hand over the front of her charcoal dress. Her access badge swung once against the table edge, catching the light. 7 years of work, loyalty, An invisible architecture hung from a plastic clip with her photograph on it. She removed it slowly, placed it beside the notebook, and looked at the man who had mistaken her patience for weakness. "Then build it without me," she said. The room did not breathe. Daniel's smile vanished by inches. Vanessa finally looked up, and Claire Bennett, the woman they had just tried to reduce to a footnote, turned away from the table she had built, walked toward the glass doors, and left behind a company that had no idea its foundation had just walked out. Claire did not remember the elevator ride down, only the reflection of herself in the mirrored doors, pale but steady, her brown hair tucked behind one ear, her mouth set in a line so calm it almost belonged to someone else. By the time she stepped into the lobby, the marble floor beneath her heels sounded too loud, each click like a small verdict. 7 years earlier, there had been no marble lobby, no receptionist with a headset, no wall of framed magazine covers praising Daniel Bennett as one of Boston's most visionary business leaders. There had only been a cramped second-floor office above a print shop in Cambridge, 2 folding desks, 1 unreliable heater, and Daniel pacing between them with a dream bigger than their bank account. Back then, he still said, we can build this. We can survive 1 more quarter. We just need 1 client to believe in us." Claire had believed first, not because Daniel was brilliant in the way newspapers later claimed, but because he was fearless in a room, charming in a way that made cautious people lean forward. He could make a half-formed idea sound inevitable. Claire could take that idea apart, rebuild it into something profitable, and hand it back to him before sunrise with the numbers corrected, the risks contained, and the weak spots hidden beneath polished language. That had been their balance. He drew attention. She built trust. He opened doors. She made sure there was something solid on the other side. When their first commercial real estate client threatened to walk away after discovering a financing gap of nearly $400,000, Daniel had panicked in the parking lot behind the office, his tie loosened, his confidence leaking out of him in sharp breaths. Claire had stayed up until 4 in the morning restructuring the proposal, calling 3 lenders across 2 time zones, and rewriting the investor memo line by line. Daniel delivered it the next day and got a standing handshake from men who never wasted praise. That evening, he kissed her forehead in the office kitchen and whispered, "I would be nothing without you." She had believed that too. Human beings are embarrassingly good at mistaking gratitude for loyalty, and Claire had been no exception. As Bennett Meridian grew, the small compromises arrived dressed as necessities. Daniel should be the face because investors responded better to him. Claire should remain offstage because someone had to protect the details. Daniel should take the interviews because press coverage mattered. Claire should prepare the answers because accuracy mattered more. At first, she did not mind. She was not hungry for applause. She liked the quiet authority of being necessary. But necessity, when left unnamed long enough, begins to look like background. Their first office upgrade came after the Hartwell account, a hotel redevelopment deal that doubled their revenue in 1 year. Claire had been the one who noticed the property tax exposure hidden in the county filings. Claire had been the one who warned Daniel not to overpromise the renovation timeline. Claire had been the one who spent Thanksgiving weekend building 3 alternate projections while Daniel flew to Palm Beach to maintain investor relationships, a phrase that sounded better than drinking bourbon with men who liked him more when he laughed at their jokes. The deal closed in January. By March, Daniel was on the cover of a regional business journal under the headline "The Man Who Saw What Others Missed." Claire bought 3 copies at a grocery store in Brookline, stood in the checkout line between a woman holding flowers and a teenager buying energy drinks, and felt something inside her quietly step backward. Daniel framed the cover and hung it near the entrance of their new office. "It is good for credibility," he said when she stared at it too long. She smiled because she was his wife, his partner, and apparently his public relations department. Then came the staff, the analysts, the assistants, the associates who called Daniel Sir and Claire by her first name because Daniel had never corrected them. Still, she stayed. She stayed because the company was not just his ambition. It was her architecture. Every client file carried her fingerprints. Every internal process had been built from her refusal to let chaos pretend to be growth. And somewhere beneath the long hours, missed dinners, and Daniel's increasing affection for rooms where people applauded him, she kept hoping he would remember. Not publicly, perhaps. Not loudly. Just honestly. By the time Vanessa Cole appeared at a branding retreat in Nantucket, Daniel had already begun believing the myth Claire had helped him sell. Vanessa simply gave that myth a prettier mirror. Vanessa Cole entered Daniel's orbit with the soft precision of a person who understood that ambition was easier to flatter than intelligence. The branding retreat in Nantucket had been Daniel's idea, though Claire had built the agenda, booked the venue, reviewed the budget, and quietly rewritten the keynote he delivered beneath a white tent overlooking the Atlantic. It was late September, the kind of coastal weekend where everything looked expensive without admitting it was trying. The hotel smelled of salt, cedar, and imported candles. Consultants in linen jackets drank sparkling water from glass bottles and used words like transformation, repositioning, and legacy as though they were laying bricks instead of fog. Vanessa had been introduced as an outside communications strategist from New York, someone with a reputation for turning regional firms into national names. She was polished, quick, and careful with her attention. In a room full of people trying to impress Daniel, she did something more effective. She made him feel observed, not studied, not challenged, not measured against the numbers Claire kept in her head, but admired. Claire noticed it before Daniel did, because Claire noticed everything. She saw how Vanessa laughed half a second before the others, how she repeated Daniel's phrases back to him as if they were original philosophies, how she tilted every conversation toward the version of him he most wanted to believe. When Daniel said Bennett Meridian needed to stop thinking like a boutique advisory firm and start acting like an institution, Vanessa leaned forward and said, "That is exactly the kind of leadership this market has been waiting for." Claire, who had just spent 2 weeks warning him that expansion without operational controls would expose them to compliance failures in 3 states, looked down at her coffee and said nothing. That became the pattern. Vanessa spoke in sunlight. Claire spoke in load-bearing walls. And Daniel, like many men who confuse brightness with warmth, began drifting toward the sunlight. At first, it was professional. Vanessa stayed late after meetings to discuss brand architecture. She sent Daniel articles about executive visibility and market influence. She suggested a video series, a new investor luncheon format, a refreshed public profile. Claire did not object to the ideas because some of them were useful. That was the most irritating part. Vanessa was not foolish. She was dangerous precisely because she understood enough to sound right in rooms where no one had time to verify the foundation. But she did not understand the clients. She did not know that the Halden family trusted Bennett Meridian because Claire remembered the patriarch's fear of debt after his father lost a farm in Vermont. She did not know that the Whitcomb portfolio only stayed with them because Claire had flown to Chicago during a snowstorm and spent 9 hours explaining a tax exposure over diner coffee. She did not know that half the company's revenue depended less on Daniel's speeches than on relationships Claire had maintained with handwritten notes, remembered anniversaries, and calls returned within 10 minutes. Vanessa understood the stage. Claire understood the people sitting in the dark. By Thanksgiving, Daniel was quoting Vanessa at home. Their townhouse in Beacon Hill, once Claire's refuge from the office, became another conference room with softer lighting. He would stand at the kitchen island in shirt sleeves, scrolling through mock-ups on his phone, saying things like, "Vanessa thinks we need a younger advisory voice," or "Vanessa believes legacy clients respect confidence more than caution." Claire would slice vegetables, rinse wine glasses, or sort through client briefs and feel the strange loneliness of being married to someone who now treated her judgment like furniture he had outgrown. The first time Vanessa joined a private strategy dinner, Claire wore a gray silk blouse and a smile disciplined enough to qualify as engineering. Vanessa arrived with a bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir and complimented the house as if she were evaluating it for acquisition. Daniel watched her move through the room with open approval. Claire watched him watching, and something old inside her folded itself away for protection. Those two hung the company Claire had built, waiting like a house whose owner had begun inviting strangers to admire the curtains while termites moved quietly through the beams. By December, Vanessa had stopped behaving like a consultant and started moving through Bennett Meridian as though she were measuring the walls for her own portrait. She took calls in the corner office lounge, revised meeting invitations without asking Claire, and began using phrases like "our direction" and "my conversation with Daniel" in a tone that made junior staff glance at one another before quickly pretending to type. Her influence did not arrive as a thunderclap. Still, coffee warming her fingers through the cardboard sleeve. Through the glass, Vanessa tapped the screen with a manicured nail and said something that made Daniel nod. Claire could not hear the words, but she could read the room. She had read harder rooms than this. Rooms where lenders were preparing to walk away. Rooms where angry clients sat with crossed arms. Rooms where Daniel had frozen and she had saved him by knowing exactly which number mattered most. This room was different. This was not panic. This was planning. Later that afternoon, Daniel asked her to join him in his office. He did not close the door all the way, a coward's version of privacy. His desk looked staged, as always, with one expensive pen, one framed magazine cover, and one photograph from their 10th anniversary trip to Maine. Though Claire suspected he had forgotten, it was still there. He leaned back in his chair and spoke gently, which was how she knew the conversation had been rehearsed. "I want you to understand this is not personal," he said. Claire looked at him, then at the anniversary photograph, where they were standing on a rocky beach in Acadia National Park, wind in her hair, his arm around her shoulders, both of them younger and foolish enough to believe shared effort created shared loyalty. "Then why does it sound personal?" she asked, a company unaware that its owners were standing on opposite sides of a fault line. Daniel reached for a folder and slid it across the desk. "We are proposing a board expansion in January." Vanessa would take a formal seat. "You would remain essential in an operational advisory capacity." Claire did not touch the folder. She already knew what was inside. Polished language, careful demotion, betrayal printed on heavyweight paper. "Operational advisory capacity," she repeated. Daniel looked relieved, mistaking her calm for surrender. That had always been his favorite mistake. "Exactly. It protects your strengths." Claire stood slowly. "No, Daniel. It protects your story." His relief vanished. For one brief second, the man beneath the executive polish looked back at her, startled, almost afraid. Claire left the folder on his desk and walked out before he could find another elegant phrase for erasing her. The January board meeting arrived on a morning so cold that frost clung to the edges of the conference room windows like lace. Boston had been buried under 4 inches of snow overnight, and from 12 floors up the city looked softened, almost forgiving, as though the streets below had agreed to hide every dirty corner beneath a clean white sheet. Claire knew better. Some things only looked clean from a distance. She arrived 20 minutes early, as she always did, carrying her navy leather notebook, a slim black folder, and the kind of composure that had taken years to build and 1 month to make necessary. The office was unusually quiet. Even the reception desk seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. A vase of white tulips sat near the elevator, probably chosen by Vanessa, because Vanessa loved anything that looked tasteful and temporary. Claire paused at the glass wall outside the boardroom. Inside, the long walnut table had already been set with water glasses, printed packets, silver pens, and nameplates. Her eyes found her seat before her mind could protect her. Or rather, where her seat had been. For 6 years, Claire had sat to Daniel's right, close enough to correct a number under her breath, far enough to let him believe the room belonged to him. That chair now held a new brass nameplate. Vanessa Cole. Claire's own nameplate had been moved to the far end of the table, near the wall console, the place usually reserved for legal observers and people invited to listen rather than decide. The message was childish in its obviousness, which somehow made it crueler. Adults rarely need much imagination to be unkind. Claire stepped into the room and set her notebook at the end of the table without touching the new nameplate. Martin Shaw was already there, pretending to review a spreadsheet. His face tightened when he saw her, guilt passing over it like a cloud that did not intend to rain. "Morning, Claire," he said softly. "Martin," she replied. That was all. He had known about the seating. He had likely approved the packet. Perhaps he had even told himself there was nothing he could do. People love that sentence. It lets them sleep while someone else pays the price for their comfort. One by one, the directors entered, shaking snow from their coats, murmuring about traffic on Interstate 93, the plows on Beacon Street, the cold snap coming in from Canada. Ordinary talk, harmless talk, the kind people use to avoid the sound of a moral decision settling into the room. Daniel arrived last, with Vanessa beside him. He wore a charcoal suit and the silver cufflinks Claire had given him after their first $1 million quarter. Vanessa wore winter white and carried a leather portfolio embossed with the Bennett Meridian logo, though Claire knew she had not earned the right to carry that mark with such ease. Daniel's eyes flicked briefly to Claire's place at the end of the table. He expected anger. He had prepared for tears, perhaps even a scene he could later describe as unfortunate, but predictable. Claire gave him none of it. She opened her notebook, uncapped her pen, and waited. The meeting began with Martin reading quarterly projections in a voice dry enough to sand furniture. Revenue was strong, officially. Pipeline value was promising, officially. Client retention remained stable, officially. Claire listened to every polished phrase and heard what had been left out. 2 renewal calls delayed. 1. Investor group requesting additional oversight. 1 family office still waiting for Daniel to answer a question Claire had already drafted a response to 3 days earlier. Stability, in a boardroom, often meant no one had admitted the problem out loud yet. Then Daniel stood. His smile returned, smooth and practiced. The same smile that had once made lenders lean forward and journalists write flattering lies. As you all know, Bennett Meridian is entering its next stage of growth, he began. To meet that moment, we need leadership that understands not only where the market has been, but where it is going. Claire watched Vanessa lower her eyes with perfect modesty. The performance was nearly beautiful, in the way a locked door can be beautiful when someone else holds the key. Daniel clicked the remote. The first slide appeared, board expansion and strategic brand evolution. There were phrases about national visibility, executive presence, and modern client engagement. There were charts with upward arrows, none of which explained how the company would protect a client's money during a downer. There were photographs of Daniel speaking at events, Daniel shaking hands, Daniel standing beneath lights that made him look taller than he was. Then came Vanessa's section. Daniel described her as a visionary strategist, a trusted advisor, a necessary voice for the future of the firm. Claire kept her face still. She had learned long ago that silence could be mistaken for weakness only by people who had never seen what it could hold. When Daniel finally said, "I move that Vanessa Cole be appointed to the board effective immediately," the room turned careful. Papers shifted. Pens paused. Martin looked at the table. The first vote came from Edward Lang, an outside director who owed Daniel 3 favors, and Claire one apology he had never made. "Approved," he said. Then another. Then another. By the time Martin whispered his approval, Claire had already closed something inside herself that would never open for these people again. Daniel looked toward her at last, almost gently, as if offering mercy after arranging the wound. "Claire," he said, "we value your continued support. In this transition," Claire looked at the new nameplate beside him, then at the folder in front of her, untouched and unnecessary. "No," she said quietly. One word, clean as glass. Daniel blinked. "Excuse me." Claire stood, placed her pen across the center of her notebook, and looked around the table at every person who had confused her restraint with permission. "You do not want my support. You want my silence. Those are different services, and I am no longer offering either one." For a moment, no one seemed to understand what Claire had said, not because the words were complicated, but because people who benefit from obedience are always confused by its sudden disappearance. Daniel stared at her from the head of the table, one hand still resting on the remote control, his thumb frozen above the button as if the next slide might rescue him. Strong company has to evolve beyond its original structure. Claire turned her eyes to Vanessa. "You have been here for 11 weeks. The sentence was quiet enough to be polite and sharp enough to make Edward Lang cough into his fist. Vanessa's cheeks colored, but she recovered quickly. And sometimes fresh perspective is exactly what an established firm needs. Claire nodded once, as if considering the point. Fresh perspective is useful. Replacing institutional knowledge with presentation skills is expensive. Martin's pen stopped moving. One of the directors shifted in his chair. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had always hated when Claire said the simple thing everyone else worked so hard to decorate. "This is not the forum for this," Daniel said. "Then you chose the wrong forum to make it public," Claire replied. She reached for her access badge, the one she had placed beside her notebook earlier that morning, and held it for a moment between 2 fingers. The plastic was warm from the table lights. Her photograph looked younger than she felt, taken 3 years earlier on a day when she had still believed exhaustion could be noble if it served something lasting. Personal clients using my name, my history with them, or any implied endorsement from me. Several of those relationships predate Bennett Meridian. Cowardly. Often, in business, the two were the same tie. The elevator descended smoothly, floor numbers glowing above the doors, 12, 11, 10, each one lowering her away from a life she had spent nearly a decade holding together with discipline, memory, and the kind of loyalty that never made it into annual reports. Her phone began vibrating before she reached the lobby. Martin first, then Daniel, then an unknown number that was probably one of the outside directors discovering the convenience of concern after the vote had already been cast. Claire did not answer. She walked through the lobby past the framed magazine covers, past the receptionist who looked up with wide eyes and then quickly looked down, past the winter tulips and the security desk where her name would be removed from the system by lunch. Outside, Federal Street hit her with January air so sharp it felt almost medicinal. Snowmelt darkened the curb. Taxi tires hissed through slush. A delivery driver shouted into the cold. Boston continued with its usual indifference, which Claire found strangely comforting. The city did not care that her marriage had become a contract dispute or that her company had become a stage for another woman's ascent. The city cared about parking, rent, coffee, and whether the sidewalks had been salted. Nameplate. Her phone vibrated again. This time the screen showed Daniel Bennett. She let it ring until it stopped. A text followed almost immediately. "We need to talk before this becomes damaging." Claire looked at the message, then turned the phone face down. Company-wide email announcing a bold new chapter, complete with tasteful language about momentum, innovation, and expanded leadership. Employees replied with polite congratulations because salaries teach people extraordinary restraint. For 3 days, Daniel believed the transition had held. He moved through the office with slightly too much energy, held impromptu meetings, and praised Vanessa's strategic clarity in front of anyone within hearing distance. Vanessa, for her part, redesigned the investor presentation, changed the color palette from navy to a sleek metallic gray, and suggested that all client communications become more emotionally aspirational. No one knew what that meant, but several people nodded anyway, because corporate America has been nodding at nonsense since the invention of conference rooms. Then the first real problem arrived. Whitcomb Holdings postponed its renewal call. Not canceled, not refused, simply postponed, which in Daniel's world sounded harmless until Martin Shaw explained that Whitcomb represented nearly 18% of Bennett Meridian's annual advisory revenue, tracked exposure across 12 client accounts. Both were careful, respectful, and absolutely devastating. They did not threaten. They did not accuse. They simply asked whether the firm's risk governance would remain intact without Claire's oversight. Human Resources sent Daniel a summary. Daniel sent it to Martin. Martin did not reply for 20 minutes, which was the executive equivalent of screaming into a pillow. Meanwhile, Claire spent that same week in her small Beacon Hill townhouse, not resting exactly, but breathing in a way she had not managed for years. The house was quiet now that Daniel had moved into a serviced apartment near the seaport, claiming he needed space to think. She had let him take the modern furniture he liked and kept the bookshelves, the old kitchen table, and the blue ceramic lamp her mother had given her when she was 26. On Monday morning, she made coffee without checking email before the water boiled. On Tuesday, she slept until 7:30 and woke with sunlight on the floor instead of panic in her throat. On Wednesday, she met Nora Whitfield at a legal office overlooking the public garden, where snow rested on the bare branches like folded linen. Nora reviewed the response from Bennett Meridian's counsel and gave Claire the closest thing lawyers offer to encouragement, a calm nod over a stack of documents. "They are nervous," Nora said. "Not because you broke anything, because you kept everything clean." Claire looked down at her hands. "I spent years making sure there would be no mess." Nora's mouth curved. "That may turn out to be the most expensive gift you ever gave them." By the second week, Daniel called again. Claire let it go to voicemail. His voice sounded controlled, but thinner than before. He said they needed to discuss client perception. He said the market was reacting unpredictably. He said Vanessa was doing her best. Claire listened once, standing beside her kitchen window with snow melting along the sill, and deleted the message before it ended. Not out of anger. Anger would have meant she was still in the room with him. This was something colder and cleaner. This was refusal. That afternoon, an envelope arrived by courier. No return name on the outside. Inside was a handwritten note on heavy cream stationery. Claire recognized the signature immediately. Eleanor Hayes, founder of Hayes Capital Partners, one of Boston's most private and respected investors, a woman Daniel had once dismissed as old money with outdated instincts. The note contained only 2 lines. Men like Daniel love saying they built the house. They rarely remember who drew the blueprint. Lunch tomorrow, if you are ready to stop holding up someone else's roof. Claire met Eleanor Hayes the next afternoon at a private dining room above a discreet Back Bay restaurant where the windows overlooked Commonwealth Avenue, and the servers knew how to disappear before a conversation became valuable. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish, roasted coffee, and old money that had learned not to announce itself. Eleanor was already seated when Claire arrived, wearing a charcoal wool suit, a single strand of pearls, and the expression of a woman who had spent 40 years watching powerful men mistake volume for judgment. She did not rise. She simply gestured to the chair across from her and said, "You look less ruined than Daniel hoped." Claire almost smiled as she removed her gloves. "I did not know he had given you an update." "He did not need to." Eleanor poured tea from a silver pot with hands steady enough to sign a billion-dollar term sheet during an earthquake. Men like Daniel leave fingerprints all over their panic. Claire sat, placing her Navy notebook beside the plate. For the first time since leaving Bennett Meridian, she felt not exposed, but seen, and there was a difference so sharp it nearly hurt. Eleanor had been one of the first serious investors Daniel ever tried to impress. He had walked into her office 6 years earlier with a dazzling pitch, a bright smile, and projections so optimistic they bordered on fiction. Claire had been the one who answered Eleanor's questions after Daniel ran out of polish. She had corrected the assumptions, named the risks, and admitted what they did not yet know. Daniel had apologized afterward for her being too cautious. Eleanor had invested $2 million the following month. "I always wondered when you would get tired of building ceilings for him to stand on," Eleanor said. Claire looked toward the window. Below, traffic moved slowly through the winter light, pedestrians stepping around gray piles of snow along the curb. "I thought loyalty meant staying until the work was safe." "That is one definition," Eleanor said. "Usually written by the person benefiting from your loyalty." The server entered with soup, salad, and warm bread, then vanished with the precision of someone trained around confidential money. Claire had not realized how hungry she was until the smell of rosemary and butter rose from the table. For years, lunch had been something she handled between calls: half a protein bar, cold coffee, a salad eaten while reviewing debt covenants. Sitting still felt almost rebellious. Eleanor waited until Claire had taken 3 bites before sliding a folder across the table. It was cream-colored, heavy, and unbranded. Inside were market analyses, capital commitments, client migration projections, and a proposed structure for a new advisory firm. Claire read the first page twice. Hayes Bennett Capital. Her breath stopped at the second name. "Why is my name on this?" "Because it should have been on the door years ago." Claire touched the paper lightly, as if it might vanish if handled too quickly. "Daniel will say I stole his clients." Eleanor gave a dry, elegant laugh. "Daniel says many things. It is one of his cheaper assets." Claire turned another page. Initial capitalization, $15 million. Operational runway, 24 months. Founding role, managing partner. Authority over client risk, strategy, and governance, full. The words looked unreal, not because they were extravagant, but because they were clear. No hidden demotion. No velvet knife. No seat at the far end of the table. "Why now?" Claire asked. Eleanor leaned back. "Because your exit created proof. Before, people could pretend Daniel was the architect and you were the careful wife who handled details. Now they will see what happens when the details walk away." Claire closed the folder, though her hand remained on top of it. "I am not interested in revenge." "Good," Eleanor said. "Revenge is emotional and usually poorly priced. I am interested in competence. So are your clients." The sentence settled between them with the quiet weight of a door unlocking. Claire thought of Daniel's office, Vanessa's new nameplate, Martin's lowered eyes, the badge lying between 2 people who had wanted her usefulness without her authority. Then she thought of Mrs. Halden's message, Whitcomb's postponed renewal, the analysts asking the questions Daniel did not know how to answer. For years, Claire had believed the moral choice was to keep the structure standing, even when the person inside it stopped deserving the shelter. Perhaps the better choice was to build something with doors that opened honestly, with photographs of Daniel looking toward imaginary horizons. But beneath the shine, the firm was losing oxygen. Wickham had not renewed. The Halden family office had moved into review status. 2 analysts had resigned within a week of each other, both with polite notes and suspiciously calm expressions. A hotel redevelopment deal in Providence had stalled after Vanessa's team failed to catch a zoning restriction Claire would have seen before lunch. Daniel had begun sleeping poorly, though he called it strategy fatigue because men like Daniel preferred any phrase that did not sound like fear. That evening, he arrived with Vanessa on his arm, both of them dressed for victory they had not earned. Everyone else, though the last word seemed aimed directly at his chest. O'Donnell beside her, passed between them, not warmly, but unmistakably. Cambridge, late nights, cold pizza, first clients, the illusion of partnership. Then it was gone. Daniel. Her voice was neutral. That hurt more than anger would have. Anger, at least, would have meant there was still a rope between them. You look well, he said, because apparently the English language had collapsed and left him with scraps. Embarrassment that he had not lost a wife, or an operations lead, or a quiet woman at the end of the table. He had lost the reason powerful people believed him. The transfer of the Whitcomb account did not make a sound loud enough for the ballroom to hear, but Daniel felt it more sharply than any public disgrace could have managed. It was the quiet kind of loss, the kind that moved through legal notices, client portals, revised wire instructions, and board minutes, leaving no dramatic wreckage for pride to argue with. Robert Ellis shook Claire's hand, nodded once to Eleanor, and walked away as if he had simply confirmed the weather. Vanessa stared after him, her polished expression struggling to rearrange itself into something useful. Daniel stood between the 2 women, one he had elevated because she made him feel powerful, and one he had discarded because she actually was. For several seconds, no one spoke. The orchestra near the far wall began a soft jazz standard. Silverware chimed against china, donors laughed beneath chandeliers, and the world, cruelly efficient as always, continued serving dinner. Claire, Daniel said, and this time her name did not sound like a possession. It sounded like a request. She looked at him without anger. That was the final mercy and the final punishment. Daniel. He swallowed. I made mistakes. Vanessa turned toward him quickly, but he did not look at her. The admission hung there, small and late, like a candle brought after the house had already found daylight. Claire set her glass on a passing server's tray. Yes, she said. You did. He seemed to expect more, perhaps a speech, perhaps the old Claire who would organize even his remorse into something productive. But she had no interest in managing his collapse. I thought the company needed a different face, he said. You thought it needed your reflection, Claire replied. The words were not cruel. They were accurate, which made them harder to survive. Vanessa's voice cut in, lower now, stripped of some of its brightness. This is unfair. Daniel gave you a platform for years. Claire turned to her with a calm so complete it made Vanessa look younger than she was. No, Vanessa, I gave him one. You mistook the spotlight for the structure. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it. There are moments when even vanity recognizes a locked door. Eleanor appeared at Claire's side then, not intervening, not rescuing, simply arriving with the authority of someone whose presence changed the temperature of a conversation. Claire, the Mercer Group is ready when you are, she said. Claire nodded. Daniel looked from Eleanor to Claire, and for the first time seemed to understand that the meeting he wanted would never happen, not because Claire was bitter, but because he no longer belonged on her calendar. Can we talk tomorrow? He asked quietly. Claire picked up her black portfolio. Your counsel can speak with mine. It was the language he had chosen months ago, returned to him without ornament. She walked away with Eleanor toward a table of investors who stood as she approached. Daniel watched them rise for her, not because she was someone's wife, not because she arrived on his arm, not because a man had introduced her as valuable, but because they already knew. The following weeks moved with the precision of paperwork. Whitcomb completed its transition. The Halden family office followed before Memorial Day. 2 more clients requested formal reviews, then quietly left. Martin Shaw resigned in June after what the press called a difference in strategic direction, a phrase so vague it deserved its own retirement plan. By midsummer, Bennett Meridian's board asked Vanessa to step down from her seat. thanking her for her contributions in a statement that used 12 sentences to say almost nothing. Daniel remained chief executive for another 43 days. Then the board appointed an interim leader from outside the firm, someone steady, gray-haired, and allergic to spectacle. Daniel's departure announcement described him as a visionary founder pursuing new opportunities. Claire read the article once in her office at Hayes Bennett Capital, then closed the browser without saving it. Her office was not large, but it faced the Charles River, and in the late afternoon the water caught the sun in long gold strips. On her desk sat the navy leather notebook, worn at the corners, no longer a symbol of invisible labor but a record of what she had survived. Beside it was a brass nameplate that read Claire Bennett, managing partner. She touched the edge of it once before opening a client file. There was no victory music, no grand revenge, no need to watch Daniel lose what he had mistaken for his alone. She had learned something cleaner than revenge. When a person builds the foundation, walking away is not destruction. It is simply refusing to hold up a house where your name has been removed from the door. In September, almost 9 months after Claire walked out of the boardroom, she returned to Cambridge for the first time without feeling the old ache in her chest. Hayes Bennett Capital had taken a modest office near Kendall Square, not because Eleanor could not afford something grander, but because Claire wanted the first expansion to feel honest. The building had brick walls, tall windows, and a freight elevator that complained like an elderly man every time it moved between floors. It reminded her of the beginning, before the magazine covers, before the polished lies, before Daniel learned to confuse being admired with being right. On the first morning, she arrived before 7 with 2 cardboard trays of coffee, because some habits built from care were worth keeping. Priya was already at her desk, reviewing client notes with her shoes kicked off beneath the chair. James had fallen asleep briefly over a risk model and woke when Claire set a cup beside him. "You are saving lives," he said, blinking at the lid. "Only portfolios," Claire replied. "The lives are their own responsibility." He laughed, and the sound moved through the half-finished office like warmth. There were no framed covers on the walls, not yet. Instead, Claire had hung a simple whiteboard listing every active client, every pending review, every promise that had been made and needed to be kept. It was not glamorous. It was better than glamorous. It was accountable. Around 10, Eleanor arrived carrying a box of pastries from a bakery in the South End and wearing the expression of a woman who considered muffins a reasonable substitute for sentiment. She stopped in Claire's doorway and looked at the brass nameplate newly installed beside it. "It suits you," she said. Claire glanced at it. Claire Bennett, managing partner. The words still startled her sometimes, not because she doubted them, but because clarity can feel strange after years of translation. "It took long enough," she said. Eleanor set the pastry box on the table. "Most foundations are underground. That does not make them less important." Later that afternoon, after the team meeting and before the Halden review call, Claire received a handwritten envelope at reception. No company logo, no return address. She knew Daniel's handwriting before she opened it, which annoyed her more than it hurt. Memory is an inefficient filing system, apparently designed by someone with no respect for emotional storage space. Inside was a short note. He wrote that he was leaving Boston for a consulting role in Denver. He wrote that he understood now, at least partly, what he had taken for granted. He wrote that he hoped one day she would remember that they had built something real before he ruined it. There was no request for a meeting, no legal language, no attempt to sound like the hero of a softer story. Claire read the note once, then folded it carefully and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk, not because she wanted to preserve him, but because some chapters deserve a cover, not a fire. She looked out the window at the Charles River, where rowing shells cut thin lines through the water beneath a pale autumn sky. For years, she had believed being loyal meant staying until someone recognized her value. Now she understood that value does not become real when someone else admits it. It is real in the work, in the records kept clean, in the boundaries finally drawn, in the courage to leave before resentment turns you into someone you do not recognize. That evening, after the last client call ended, Claire turned off the office lights one by one. At the door, she paused and looked back at the desks, the whiteboard, the coffee cups, the quiet evidence of a company being built without erasing the people building it. She did not feel victorious in the way stories often demand. She felt steady, Whole. Unborrowed. Outside, Cambridge glowed under streetlights, and the air smelled of rain on brick. Claire pulled her coat closed and walked toward her car with her notebook under her arm, no longer carrying proof of what she had done for someone else, but plans for everything she was finally doing in her own name.